Okay, so in previous videos, we've been trying to unpack the employment relationship a little bit, thinking about the context, important contextual aspects that define and influence the nature of the relationship, and then internal contextual ideology and the potential for mobilization on the part of the workforce. What we're going to turn to now is to think more about the processes of employment relations, what employment relations actors do in relation to each other. And here we're thinking principally about representatives, about agents, not about the employers necessarily, but usually through the agents of management and not directly the workforce, but principally agents on their behalf, most usually trade unions, and the engagements that they have with each other. So we're talking about negotiations, we're talking about bargaining, and the most thorough framework of negotiations that we have to make sense of this was developed back in the 1960s by Walton and McKersey, and they identify four main forms of bargaining that we're going to talk about in this next series of videos. The first one is perhaps the one that we might normally associate with employment relations bargaining. It's distributive bargaining, and we're going to talk about that in this video here today. But they also identify three other forms of bargaining that we'll cover in subsequent videos. Integrative bargaining, which is more cooperative in nature, attitudinal structuring, which is about how we influence our opponents in a bargaining situation, and intra-organisational bargaining, which is about how these agents of employment relations actors, or principals as we call them, how these actors engage with their principals, how they bring them along with them, how they convince them that the deals, the agreements, the compromises that they've made are the right ones, and they can make a deal stick. So they're the four main forms of bargaining that we're interested in. But we're going to start here today by looking at the first, distributive bargaining. Now, the main characteristic of distributive bargaining is that distributive bargaining deals with issues that are essentially conflictual in nature. So we most often associate this with pay bargaining. You know, if the workforce would like a pay rise and the organisation would rather keep that money that would go into a pay rise for shareholder dividends or to invest in the organisation or whatever, they can't have it both ways. The money either goes to the workforce or it gets retained by the organisation. There's no obvious way to kind of square that circle. So for the workforce to win its pay claim, the organisation has to lose its objective in terms of what it would rather do with that organisational resource. So there's a basic conflict built into distributive bargaining issues, and that defines the characteristic of this kind of bargaining. It becomes shrewd. It becomes a game of kind of cat and mouse. It's all about having a poker face. It's about making sure that you don't give too much away. It is that kind of careful game of to and fro that we associate with, you know, many high-level bargaining situations where there is a winner and there is a loser. And so it's important to try and maintain a position as a negotiator that you don't lose. You know, that's the risk. You're there to gain as much as you possibly can for your principals, for those people that you represent. And so you have to play a careful, shrewd game of bargaining. So these issues are conflictual. However, that conflict, that win-lose, zero-sum game kind of situation exists within the framework of a broader relationship that remains mutually beneficial, mutually useful. Now that's an important point to make, because whilst these conflicts occur around the issues that we bargain with within distributive bargaining frameworks, there's an incentive, there's a push for the parties to that bargaining situation to continue to engage with each other. This isn't like a commercial negotiation. So we try and bargain a good price for a house or a car or whatever else it is, or a commercial negotiation in a corporate context where you have a kind of often quite a fleeting relationship with the other side of the negotiation. They have something that you want, you're trying to drive the price down, you can kind of bargain hard, and if it doesn't pay off, you kind of walk away, you find alternatives, you never have to kind of cross each other's paths again. The difference with an employment relationship is that that relationship is usually enduring. It continues. It's something that carries on for years and even decades. And that employment relationship as a whole is of benefit to both sides. The workforce require the organisation to succeed, ultimately, because it maintains their capacity to work, to earn a living. The organisation needs to make sure that its workforce are at least moderately happy. Otherwise, they're going to face continuing problems with motivation and performance, maybe employee turnover, maybe they lose essential qualities in terms of the activities of their workforce, and the organisation doesn't prosper and might even fail. So there's this framework surrounding a conflictual distributive bargain which requires both sides to engage with it in good faith and to try and make sure that they don't screw over the other side in too obvious a way or too dramatic a way, because it can have longer term consequences for the cooperative aspects that surround the relationship as a whole. So these distributive bargaining issues, they tend to be conflictual, and so the things that we're talking about have fall into certain categories. We talked about pay issues, so economic issues tend to be first and foremost in terms of the concerns that are covered within distributive bargaining activities. So the kinds of things that we'll be doing on this course: trying to establish a new pay system, trying to win advantages to one side or the other. Those basic economic issues and interests and objectives, these fall right in the middle of what distributive bargaining is usually concerned with. However, it's not just economic issues that distributive bargaining concerns itself with. We also see questions of rights and obligations. So if you remember in the previous video, we were talking about managerial relations, limits to management control, about what systems of organisational justice we might have in an organisation, about how what kind of procedures and policies and practices we might put in. Those kinds of rights and obligations are all kind of tied up in that area. How the employment relationship should function, how we should structure the antagonism. Those kinds of things might come under the ambit of distributive bargaining issues as well. We might also find ourselves bargaining in order to alter the relationship pattern in one way or another, that we might see this as a direct objective and something that we could try and affect through distributive bargaining practices. In terms of how each side approaches distributive bargaining, obviously distributive bargaining is very complex, and there are lots of strategies, many tactics that are employed in specific situations within this kind of bargaining activity. But the general approach towards establishing a bargaining position, setting bargaining objectives on each side of the negotiation, is governed by three concepts. The first is what we call utility. So how much good do we get out of this thing that we might attempt to secure through bargaining? How much potential utility has it got? So a big pay rise, big potential utility, can affect the quality of life, can change the lifestyles of the workforce, make life easier, pay the bills a little bit better. high potential utility, reduced working hours, those kinds of things, high potential utility. So the higher that utility offers to either side, then in general terms, all other things being equal, the stronger a negotiator would attempt to push for that, the higher up the negotiating agenda that comes. So that's why we often see negotiations that start off with a long list of objectives. But over the course of the negotiation, some of the lower utility items just fall off the bottom. They simply aren't significant enough. They don't offer enough utility. They don't offer enough benefit to be worthwhile pushing through to the end of the process. They're things that might get used as bargaining chips. Trade encounters. Okay, so we want this thing, we really want this thing, but we're willing to trade this thing, which for us has a lower utility. We can sacrifice that if it gets us further down the line with something else. So utility is important for a negotiation, to understand just how significant that thing is for their principles. Is this a very important issue, or is it just something that would be nice? You know, that kind of insight, that knowledge is something that a negotiator must have a clear handle on if they're going to do effective negotiations on behalf of their principles. So that's the first thing, utility. But it's not the only issue, because something can have a very high potential utility, but it may have a very low probability of success, because our opponents might regard it as something that is really harmful, or something that is really disadvantageous from their point of view. So it might be something we really want, but the chances of actually getting that thing are very low. So for a negotiator to push really hard on an issue where there's very low percentage chance of actually securing that would generally be a waste of time. It just becomes a waste of effort. It becomes something that can snarl up a negotiation, that can frustrate progress in the negotiation. It might irritate the other side. And so, that kind of needs to be taken alongside how much we want the thing in order to ascertain whether or not that's something that we would push really hard for, or whether it's something we might regard as dispensable, something that has to fall by the wayside ultimately. Now, that has to be dealt with carefully, because if it's an issue that the workforce or that our principals would be very keen to see, very high utility, but we know there's a very low probability of achieving that, communicating that complexity that is apparent to us from inside of the negotiation to the people that we represent can sometimes be difficult. And it might look, from their point of view, like we're just selling them down the river, that we're not trying hard enough. So kind of letting an issue like that disappear is something that we would need to kind of bear in mind as to how we deal with that once we go back to our principles. And that's where issues like where the process of intra-organisational bargaining, which we'll deal with in a later video, comes in, because there is a whole range of specific tactics and approaches that we need to consider in relation to issues like that. The third factor that affects the bargaining position of a negotiator within a distributive bargaining approach are disutilities, or the costs of achieving a particular outcome. So it may be an issue that we would really like, high potential utility, there's a reasonable probability of achieving it, but what is the cost of achieving it? What are the disutilities that we have to take on board in order to achieve that? So it might be that we feel that we can win a reasonable pay increase for a workforce, that we've got a reasonable expectation of the probability of achieving that kind of thing, but the cost of achieving that might also be high, because it may be that we need to take industrial action. We need to sacrifice wages of our principles by engaging in strike action, by withdrawing labour. There are costs incurred. Same thing can occur on the other side, from the employer's side, that there will be costs that might emerge as a result of of an industrial dispute, lost production, lost customers, lost goodwill, all of these kinds of things. These represent disutilities. Now, these three factors have to kind of be considered in conjunction with each other in order to make sense of how we order and prioritize and push for and resource particular bargaining objectives. And we'll talk in more detail about this in a future video about distributive bargaining positions. But there's a relationship between these things. How much we want it, how likely we are to get it, and how much it's going to cost us to achieve that outcome. And negotiators often implicitly weigh all of these things up in their mind. But we can think about it in a slightly more abstracted sense and figure out what the relationship is in order to identify the appropriate stance that we take towards each of our bargaining positions. Now, in terms of winners and losers, one of the characteristics of distributive bargaining is that there are winners and there are losers. This is a win-lose bargaining situation. For one side to win, the other side has to lose. For one side to gain something, the other side has to give it up. So, we think about, the outcomes of distributive bargaining in these kind of winners and losing situations. And that's why these conflictual issues result in a rather conflictual process and conflictual outcomes. The final thing that I want to say about distributive bargaining as an introduction to all of this is the kind of yawning chasm that exists around distributive bargaining. Because it's conflictual, because there are potential losses, because this is about winners and losers, there's this threat that exists around a distributive bargaining situation. And this is something that we call the default position. And this is where most of the costs or disutilities lie in terms of distributive bargaining positions that I was talking about a moment ago. This is what happens where agreement can't be reached. This is what happens when the negotiation fails. The default position where costs fall on both sides. So if we fail to agree in this kind of negotiation, it may well lead to strike action. So, strike action is a situation, as I was talking about just before, wages aren't being earned, production isn't being maintained, revenue isn't coming in for the organisation, earnings aren't coming in for the workforce. Everybody loses in that situation. So for a bargainer, a distributive bargainer, that is an important issue to deal with. How to avoid the default position whilst also using the default position as a kind of threat to hang over the head of the other side, to make them believe that you're not as frightened as the default position as they should be, to try and engineer a situation where the default position hurts you less than it hurts them. So for a union, this might be about building up a strong strike fund so that they can subsidise the wages that would be lost by striking employees. For an employer, it might be about building up stocks, identifying an alternative workforce, strike-breaking workforce, so that there is a means of kind of softening the blow of the default position for you, whilst making sure that it hurts the other side more. So these are some of the key factors that we need to think about around distributive bargaining. This is a hard form of bargaining. As I say, defined by conflict over issues that are conflictual in nature. A very important form of bargaining that we'll become very familiar with over the course of this module.